Hello everybody, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to speak to you tonight. My name is Breda Lynch. I am Supervisor Guide with the Office of Public Works and I am responsible for the day-to-day management of a number of the National Monument sites in the South East region. My base is at Tintern Abbey in Thomastown, County Kilkenny, which is the remains of a fabulous 12th century monastery. And one of the other sites that I also look after is Tintern Abbey, which is another Cistercian monastery. You can see where the theme is going. And Tintern is situated in a special area of conservation located on the Hook Peninsula in County Wexford. So its situation is quite unusual, literally unique in the country. Tintern is situated about 20 kilometres south of New Ross and about 18 kilometres away from the Hook Lighthouse, so right out on the peninsula. And I'm going to talk mostly tonight. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to the Cistercian Order, and then I'm going to discuss where the Cistercians fit into the story of the Irish Church and society in the medieval period. And then I'm going to look in more detail at Tintern Abbey, where I will discuss the changes to the Abbey which have taken place mostly in the post-dissolution period. And by doing that, really what I want to do is underline the impact both of the landscape and the later estate management on the Abbey and vice versa. Just before I begin, I just want to say that Tintern Abbey and the other national monuments referred to in this talk all fall under the protection of the Commissioners of Public Works in Ireland. So I just want to acknowledge all of my colleagues and the agents of the Commissioner for the work that they do at those sites. I also just want to thank and to acknowledge the group Ruralia, which is an international association for the archaeology of medieval and post-medieval settlement and rural life, because one section of what I'm going to talk about has been published in their conference proceedings last year, so I just want to acknowledge that. So to begin, I suppose just to say that although the idea of Christian monasticism really originated in the 4th century, the greatest influence on the development of European monasticism came with Benedict of Nursia. So this 5th century saint began his religious life as a hermit before taking the route of a more communal life and establishing a community of monks and founding the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy in 529, and so the Benedictine Order was born. Shortly after the foundation of Monte Cassino, Benedict formulated the monastic rule that would become the basis of monastic life from the 6th century right up to the present day. And the rule, known throughout history as the Rule of St. Benedict, reaffirms the ideals of the 4th century Basil of Caesarea that through a community, monks can pray and obtain salvation together. So the monk devotes himself to the Lectio Divinia, to spiritual reading, and to the Opus Dei, the work of God. This rule gave rise to a new form of monasticism, where the monastery would not be dependent on any other save its own abbot, and so the monastery is regarded as an independent unit. These would have been small, compact units of up to about 20 monks. They were self-sufficient as far as possible and really did not engage in general society. One of the main ideals of St. Benedict was self-sufficiency through manual labour, and over time then, the monasteries grew into large complexes with many ancillary buildings, and this type of organisation would become part of our landscape. Over time, many offshoots of the Benedictine Order were founded, one of which was the Cistercian Order. So founded in 1098 in the Burgundy region of France, the Cistercians sought to live by the strictest interpretation of the rule of St. Benedict. That's what sets them apart. The Cistercians, they just really took Europe by storm, founding over 350 monasteries within the first 55 years of their existence. And those 350 monasteries would have included houses in places such as modern-day France, Belgium, Czech Republic, Germany, Austria, Norway, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland by that stage as well. The Cistercian Order arrived in Ireland in around about 1142 with the foundation of Mellifont Abbey on the Louth Meath border. And the order was introduced to Ireland by Malachy of Armagh, and again, really their arrival to Ireland heralded a new era within the monastic movement here, coming after a period of reforming synods which had been held across the country. I suppose, like so many things in Ireland, the 12th century reform of the Irish Church really began in the mid-11th century. So around about the year 1028, the Viking king Sitric Silkenbeard, the king of Dublin, I should say, Sitric Silkenbeard went on pilgrimage to Rome. And therefore, Sitric undertaking this journey was really the first notable figure here to acknowledge Rome as the head of the church. On his return to Ireland, Sitric established a bishopric in Dublin with Dunawn as the first bishop, and it's also possible that he established Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. On his death in 1074, Dunawn was succeeded as bishop by a man named Patrick, and this Patrick had been trained as a monk at Worcester Cathedral. He may have been consecrated at St. Paul's. Bishop Patrick brought letters for the kings of Munster and Dublin with him from Lanfranc, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1070. And in the letters, the Archbishop outlined the need for reform through the establishment of a synod. While no synod happened immediately, the seed certainly was sown. And also, as Bishop Patrick was consecrated by Lanfranc, we can be fairly sure that that issue of reform within the Irish Church was part of the topic of discussion between the two men, and must have been really central to Patrick's mission to Ireland. This Sitric Silkenbeard, Malachy of Armagh, Donogh O'Carroll, Murchach O'Brien, among others, these all became the towering figures during this period of reform. The reforming synods began with the Synod of Cashel in 1101, when the King of Munster, Murchach O'Brien, symbolically gave Cashel of the Kings to the Church. The Synod of Cashel then was followed by a number of other synods, but most significant was the Synod of Rathbrazil, held in 1111, because it was at that event that the diocesan structure was initially established. This system of parishes combined in a diocese, placed under the jurisdiction of the bishop, collectively then placed under the archbishop, is known to us all. Armagh, Cashel, Tuam and Dublin were established as archbishoprics, along with 24 dioceses. And this new system of organisation, I suppose, put structure on the parish churches, the priests and the bishops, but another side of the church also required reorganisation, and that was the monastic side. Until this period of the late 11th, I should say, early 12th century, the monastic movement in Ireland had evolved in a way that was really dissimilar to the monastic movement on the continent, where the influence of the Roman Empire had caused the church to evolve and to develop new structures and frameworks. But obviously, as Ireland didn't come under the direct control of the empire, the church here developed in a different way, giving us that wonderful and unique legacy of the early Christian church that still resonates with us today. Those early Christian monastic sites, such as Glendalough and Clonmacnoise, were communities that evolved around very holy and charismatic individuals. So we think here of St. Kevin of Glendalough, St. Kieran of Clonmacnoise, St. Bridget of Kildare, among so many others. And those monasteries were centres of learning and of prayer. But really by the late 11th century, they just hadn't evolved in any kind of great way, either organisationally or architecturally, whereas the monasteries on the continent had, principally through the influence of the Benedictine Order. Because we've seen that the Benedictines, centuries before, had adopted a new way of building monasteries that had become the norm in places such as Gaul, modern-day France, and Central Europe. But the Irish monastic movement really hadn't evolved for centuries, but that was all about to change. As I said earlier, the Cistercians were introduced into Ireland by Malachy of Armagh around about the year 1142. The Cistercian monasteries were a product of the French ecclesiastical reform movement. They were well organised, they were architecturally and agriculturally innovative, with communities who really thought in the long term. The significance attached to the introduction of the order in Ireland is apparent when we consider that one of the chapters of the 1152 Synod of Cashel was held at Mellifont Abbey. That's only 10 years after the foundation of the monastery at Mellifont. We wonder how much of the actual structure was in existence at that time, obviously enough for the chapter of the Synod to be held there. But whatever was in existence, the fact of the matter is that it underlines the significance that was given to this new order. I guess we can assume that a good bit of the monastery was there, or the church anyway, because 5 years later in 1157 that Abbey Church at Mellifont was consecrated. And again, that fact and the I suppose record of that in the Irish annals really again underlines the significance of Mellifont, because those present on the day of the consecration of the Abbey Church included the High King of Ireland, Murta MacLachlan, Donna O'Carroll, the famous Dervigilla, who was also the wife of the King of Breffni, along with a huge amount of clergy, which included the Papal Legate. There was 3 archbishops, 18 bishops, along, we're told, with all the abbots of the land. So the consecration of the Abbey Church would have been seen as an opportunity for the guests to endow the new foundation with gifts, and land, cattle, money and valuables were all bestowed on the new monastery. It's recorded that the King of Meath granted 140 cows to the monastery, in addition to various lands within his kingdom, plus 60 ounces of gold. Donogh O'Carroll, the founder of the monastery, also he was also the King of Argyll or Oriel, and he granted another 60 ounces of gold, as did Dervigilla of Breffni, who also gave, we're told, a gold chalice and linen for the 9 altars. So again, the display of the High King endowing this new order with gifts must have been seen as both symbolic and hugely important, significant, and as such it gave both the Cistercian Order and Mellifont a national status, really. The foundation of Mellifont and the introduction of the Cistercian Order to Ireland also linked Ireland and the Irish monastic movement to that great tide of French monastic and ecclesiastical reform, of which St. Bernard and his monastery of Clairvaux were at the centre. And Mellifont really ties Ireland to that mainstream of that ecclesiastical reform. Of course, Mellifont was founded directly from Clairvaux, and those first Irish Cistercians were trained at that monastery. Among these men were Christian O'Connorkey, the first abbot of Mellifont. He was later Bishop of Lismore and also became Papal Legate. The direct link with Clairvaux also connected Mellifont to French ecclesiastical architecture and the developments that were occurring there. And so we see that the Gothic architecture is introduced into the first daughter houses founded from Mellifont, and one example of that is to be found at Baltinglass Abbey, founded by Diarmaid MacMurrough, King of Leinster, in 1148. I suppose the speed of the spread of the new order must have been really astonishing for the secular community to witness. The colloquial name for Mellifont on Monastery Moor, the Great Monastery, maybe more than any other reference, indicates just how great an impact the foundation and the construction of that monastery had on the population, reflecting that this monastery was the largest construction seen in Ireland at the time. Within 11 years of the foundation of the new order in Ireland, Mellifont had already founded 8 daughter houses, and those were situated at Bective, Clonmel, Baltinglass, Boyle, Limerick, Abbeyshrew, Kilbeggan and Newry. And of those, 7 were founded within just a 3-year period. And in addition to those 8 houses, the 2 pre-existing monasteries of Erina, which was another order, had by this time come under the remit of the Cistercians. So the size, the layout, the architecture of these new houses was completely different from the pre-existing Gaelic monasteries. The huge tracts of land that were associated with the Cistercian holdings and the impact of the order on the social, the agricultural, the economic and the architectural life of 12th century Ireland really is difficult for us to imagine. And the fact that Mellifont was in a position to have established these daughter houses within a short time after its own foundation really just indicates that the monastery had no problem with attracting manpower. Ultimately, 42 Cistercian monasteries were founded across the country. Some were part of the Mellifont or the Irish affiliation, and others were founded by the Anglo-Normans and were known as English or Anglo-Norman houses. Of the overall total, 28 monasteries were founded from Irish mother houses, with Mellifont itself, of course, founded from Clairvaux. 2 other monasteries were founded from French houses, which were Beaubec and Moycosquin. 4 had French mother houses and 7 English. So the division really just gave rise to 2 affiliations, as I said. Mellifont are Irish and English or Anglo-Norman, and those 2 groups just were at loggerheads right through the medieval period, and that in itself is an incredibly interesting story as well, but for another day. I suppose this really leads us to the issue of foundation dates, and the actual foundation date of any medieval monastery is really incredibly difficult to pin down. So unless you actually have the foundation charter that you can categorically state as the original document, then really you're just going to have to start some detective work. So for many monasteries, we depend on reconfirmation charters, which were issued when maybe territories were inherited, maybe a new title was bestowed, or a new king was crowned. And these would reconfirm the charter that went before, but often the date of the original charter then becomes unclear. We can turn to the records of the religious orders, but that doesn't always help us either, because sometimes the date that the order enters as the foundation date is actually the date maybe when the Abbey Church was completed or when it was consecrated or dedicated, which of course is an event that can occur years after the original foundation grant was made. Often the location of the monastery is not decided for a time either. So when the original grant is made to the mother house for the purpose of the foundation of a monastery, the order would send a number of people to examine the lands to decide where the monastery would be situated. We're lucky to have a wonderful reference, one of the few, from the foundation of Dunbrody Abbey, where the visitor Alan was sent from the mother house in Buildwas in Shropshire, and he actually declined the offer of the land, stating that when he came to visit, the site was a solitary waste. He said he had to take up his dwelling in a hollow oak and to set the boundaries of the land before returning to Buildwas. Upon going back to the monastery in England, he said that he informed the community at Buildwas of the waste of the place, the sterility of the lands, and the wildness and the ferocity of the neighbouring barbarians. So might leave that one there and not comment. The monks at Buildwas proclaimed the new foundation to St Mary's Abbey in Dublin, and the agreement was finalised then by the Abbot of Buildwas and the Abbot of St Mary's Abbey in Dublin. So we can see that the dating of the foundations of these monastic houses can really be very challenging. Some monasteries, though, can provide us with documentation or evidence that others can't. And so for the next part of the talk, I'm going to concentrate more on Tintern Abbey for 3 reasons. One, really because the rights and privileges that were granted to the monastery of Tintern are extant. We know what they are. And I suppose then, secondly, because of the fact that the landscape around Tintern, because it is set in a special area of conservation, the landscape hasn't been interfered with much, so it really allows us to clearly see how the original monastery and the associated complex fitted within that landscape. And then the fact that the Tintern estate passed to a family in the post-dissolution period and remained with that same family until the mid-20th century. And that invites or allows us to read the site at Tintern in ways that we just can't read many of the other medieval monastic sites in Ireland. Modern construction and incursion just hasn't occurred at the site. And so the monastic precinct, we can still identify it, we can still set the boundaries, or some of the boundaries and the layout of that as well. Tintern was firmly embedded in the Anglo-Norman tradition, so it's one of the Anglo-Norman foundations. And the foundation documentation of Tintern allows us to see the extent of the organisation and the settlement that took place at those monasteries at foundation, because the liberties and privileges granted to those monks were extensive and really had far-reaching implications for the land and for the area surrounding the monastery. They give us the impression of a solid foundation under an estate that was intended to be long-lasting. The Cistercians tended to settle far from the conversations of men, as they said, and certainly that was followed for Tintern Abbey. At Tintern, it's immediately evident that the choice of the positioning of the monastery followed many of the common Cistercian tenets. The layout of the monastery followed the usual conventional layout, so we had the church, the cloister, the claustral buildings. Interestingly, at Tintern, the tower was incorporated from the inception of the construction. And the fact that a small amount of the boundary wall still exists today, in addition to the capella and the portus, or the church outside the gates, which were literally just constructed just outside the walls of the monastery. So that exists at Tintern. So it allows us to clearly see the size of the medieval monastic complex. I'm going to do something very strange and skip now from the very beginning, from the beginning of the Cistercian period at Tintern. I'm just going to go straight to the dissolution, because I suppose what we're interested in is particularly that post-dissolution landscape. So, immediately prior to the dissolution of Tintern in 1536, the Cistercians held just over 2,300 medieval acres of land at the site. About 1,900 of which were arable, 400 were pasture, and 50 were under wood. So although the Abbey Church and the other buildings within the precinct and a garden covering about half an acre are mentioned at dissolution, they seem not to have survived for very long, or survived untouched for long. And in fact, the discord within the church and the wider society of the 16th century is reflected in the unrest in the locality of Tintern, because within 10 years of the dissolution of Tintern, Thomas Wood was in possession of the lease of the abbey, followed 11 years later by Anthony Coakley. But at some point in the intervening period, the abbey and its buildings were badly damaged by fire during an attack by the Keatings. Finally, in 1566, Anthony Coakley was the owner of Tintern Abbey, and he obtained the lease along with orders to fortify the site within 3 years to stop the incursions of the Irish. So again, this tells us of the activities in the area, and also about the fear that was associated with that too. So we have evidence in the form of dendrochronological dating of the timbers in the tower, and they prove that the tower was the first part of the church to have been remodelled, and the oak trees used there were fells between the autumn of 1569 and the following spring, and timbers from the former abbey were reused extensively throughout the house. We also have evidence of Elizabethan Fouling, which was used in the tower, both for dividing the spaces internally and for the decoration on solid walls, and evidence of both forms can actually be seen in the abbey today. The former part would have been divided into sections with swattle and daub, which would have provided then a solid barrier when dried. So the tower, once it was modified, remained an integral part of the family residence until the 20th century. I suppose while the 16th century improvement works were undertaken, Anthony Coakley and his wife Claire resided temporarily in the nearby manor of Rosegarland, and the tower we know was fit for habitation by 1576 because the couple are said to have been in residence in the old abbey when Sir William Pelham, the Lord Justice of Ireland, visited them there in that year of 1576. Traditionally then, it's believed that stones from the former Lay Brothers West Range were removed from the cloister area about that time and were used in the construction of the battlemented bridge. So the battlemented bridge is situated a short distance away from the abbey. It's located to the southeast of the abbey. The bridge itself today is also a national monument in state care, and it's situated adjacent to the monastic capella, that small church just outside the walls that I mentioned earlier. So again, this indicates the extent of the original monastic precinct. if that rubble was used in the construction of the bridge, then it was either an earlier bridge or maybe the core of the current one. But the structure of the bridge today that we can see today bears all the hallmarks of the 18th century remodelling of the abbey under Vesey Coakley, because that's indicated by the fake battlements, which were kind of a feature of the work that was carried out in the abbey at this period. The capella, that small church, was also adapted to become the final resting place of generations of the Coakley family. So that was a tradition that began in about 1584 with the interment of Sir Anthony Coakley, and ended in the mid-20th century when the family vault was sealed. I should say, obviously not now, you can't visit today, but with all the restrictions, etc. But all of these features that I'm talking about in Tintern, visitors can see those on any occasion, usually when you visit the monastery. So certainly there'd be no problem in seeing any of those issues. Hopefully some of these photos that I'm trying to introduce have appeared on the screens for you as well, so at least you'll have a mental picture of what I'm talking about too. So after the death then of Anthony Coakley, his son Thomas was next to inherit the estate, and he really amassed in excess of about 25,000 statute acres of land through foreclosing on unpaid loans. This Thomas was married twice. His first wife was a member of the Reformed Church, and his second wife was a Catholic. And following Thomas's death, the Tintern lands were divided along religious lines, and the issue of religion was a feature of the ownership of Tintern for centuries to come. While the lands were divided and reunited many times, this also allowed for either a Catholic or a Protestant owner to be in place depending on the circumstances of the time, so thereby it made it impossible for the lands to be confiscated on the grounds of religion. Traditionally, the Coakleys in the old abbey were Protestant, while the Catholic branch resided at Duffrey Hall, which is situated near Enniscorthy, in the foothills of the Blackstairs Mountains, Duffrey or Dovtira, the Black Lands. In the early 18th century, the estate was once again joined under the personage of Caesar Coakley of Duffrey Hall. And Caesar is remembered as a benevolent landlord. He supported religious freedom and was a renowned Catholic. He seems to have been kind of before his time. Caesar's model of the support of religious freedom of the period immediately following the Counter-Reformation is definitely worthy of note. Following his death in 1766, his grandson Vesey inherited Tintern. Vesey embarked on various building works at the abbey, but in reality he really squandered his inheritance. The battlemented walls that I mentioned earlier, that are a feature that adorn much of the abbey today, are a testimony to Vesey's period as owner of Tintern. A view of Tintern produced by the artist Gabriel Beringer and based on a drawing by Vesey probably best indicates the aspiration that Vesey had for the final transformation of the abbey to a Gothic mansion. This was never fully achieved, but the image might be the basis for the remodelling of the old nave. Gabriel Beringer and Bartlett both stayed at Tintern with Vesey Coakley in 1780. And at that time, Beringer described the abbey as, I think his quote was, "good quarters for man and beast. The tower of it is made a dwelling. The rest is uncovered and waste, offices being built against it." So it just gives you an idea of what had happened. He later refers then to rain coming through their rooms and, my favourite, parcels of rats and mice swarming themselves before the fire. Prior to their visit, other renovations and adaptations to the house had also taken place, principally the conversion of the original chancel into the stately home. And again, when you do finally get the chance to visit Tintern, you can see fireplaces suspended, 2 and 3 floors up as well, which are all features of this time. Tintern was next inherited by Vesey's son, who was another Caesar. But But this Caesar was held as a prisoner of war in France from 1806 to 1814, and so the estate was administered by Caesar's youngest brother, John. But the 18th century at Tintern were really very progressive years. The developments of the estate were principally driven by John, who was also involved in various other civic enhancements in nearby New Ross, where he co-founded a bank, and also in Wexford town, where he suggested improvements to the quayside. So again, obviously very forward-thinking individual. At one stage, there was a thriving weaving industry established to the southwest of the abbey, and we know that at one point it possessed 36 looms producing linen, diaper, check and woolens. And prior to 1812, a yarn market and a market house were in use near to the village of Tintern. John also then added to the commerce by establishing a flour milling industry near the village, and the remains of that mill can still be seen at the site today, but the mill was accidentally burned in the late 1790s. A brick manufacturing industry was also established at Tintern, where the red clay from what's still known as the brickfield on the opposite bank to the old capella was used to manufacture those bricks. Bricks used there were used in the refurbishment of the abbey, and they were also used in that nearby manor of Rosegarland that I had mentioned earlier on. We believe John had a keen interest in gardening and a deep understanding of planting and landscaping, and by the very end of the 18th century, about 1795, he had established a nursery to grow seedlings for the extensive plantations that he envisaged on the estate. In this, the Age of Enlightenment, it was probably not unusual that the property at Tintern would evolve into a more modern landed estate. John had intended to extend the lawns and the gardens in front of the abbey, but the village of Tintern was situated within his desired area. So he set about to moving the tenants and really improved their lot by establishing a new village of Salt Mills. Although it was out of sight of the Abbey House, Salt Mills had been a portion of the estate from the monastic period, and it's actually recorded in the dissolution records. The Salt Mill inferred was listed in that record too. I suppose the repositioning of the old village of Tintern mightn't only have been for altruistic reasons, maybe for aesthetics, but it appears certainly to have been a satisfactory move for the tenants. There is a beautiful wall garden at Tintern, and the wall garden has recently undergone extensive restoration through the very hard work of a very dedicated group of volunteers, and can be visited again when all these restrictions are lifted. But the establishment of that wall garden owes its creation to this period too. So the wall garden was constructed predominantly using brick which would have been manufactured at Tintern. The garden covers 2.5 acres and it's divided then into ornamental and kitchen gardens. There's 5 bridges constructed over the river. And there's an allusion to this garden in a letter dated to 1801 because there's a reference to fine parcels of young fruit trees and wall trees. And the garden was a necessary and I suppose a very fashionable element for the support of the fresh fruits and vegetables to the Coakley table. A nursery formed the base for the estate planting that occurred in the 19th century, and many of those trees and stands can be identified on the Ordnance Survey's maps drawn later in that century. The formal estate planning, I suppose, also provided for these tantalising glimpses of the house presented to visitors as they approach, and it's still there for us today. John also organised the formal walks within the estate, and today those are a wonderful amenity for obviously local people and for visitors. Early 20th century visitors described the approach to Tintern, remarking that the abbey lifts its towers amidst groves of stately trees. Our car, rolling down the broad avenue of the park, comes suddenly upon the ancient structure in its secluded valley. Reference was made also to the existence of a view of Tintern produced by the artist Gabriel Berninger. I mentioned that already. its expression never fully found reality, was found in reality, but it's believed that John formalised the plans for transforming the nave of the old abbey into a 3-storey residence in the Georgian Gothic style, but he didn't live to see that work completed. John was shot at dawn by his fiance's brother William Alcock in a political duel, and this ended one of the most progressive periods at Tintern. Arguably, I think it's his period probably more than any after the initial foundation and the construction of the monastery, which impacted mostly on the visual and the spatial aspects of the site as it's viewed and experienced today. After John's untimely death in the early 19th century, the estate was managed by a land agent named Thomas McCord, until eventually John's brother Caesar returned from France in 1814. Caesar then continued with John's task of establishing salt mills, and by 1831 the village had 29 houses, there was a dispensary and a boys' school also. The old village of Tintern was then demolished. Caesar was elected as an MP for Wexford in 1818, and he served in that capacity then for a time. It's believed that Caesar became dominated by his wife Jane Kerwin, who many people believe poisoned him. Whatever the truth, Caesar died in 1842 without either an heir or an uncontested will, and this led to a series of protracted lawsuits, and ultimately these lawsuits brought financial ruin on the estate from which it never actually recovered. Ultimately, the outcome was that Mary Grey Wentworth Coakley, Caesar's cousin, was declared to be the rightful heir of the estate at Tintern, and in 1852 Mary came into her inheritance. There was further legal disputes followed, but in 1857 then Mary finally settled as the rightful owner of Tintern. In 1912, Mary's granddaughter Lucy Marie Biddulph Coakley inherited the estate, and Lucy Marie, or Miss Coakley, would be the last Coakley resident in Tintern Abbey. When she came into her inheritance in the early 20th century, I suppose Ireland was a vastly different place to when her ancestors had held the estate. Political agitation and the passing of a series of land acts, coupled with a rise, of course, in nationalistic sentiment, all meant that the survival of the landed estates in Ireland was untenable. That general situation, coupled with the unstable financial situation at Tintern, all indicated a very uncertain future for the estate, and really the physical condition of the old abbey was particularly dire. Writing in the first years of the 20th century, Michael Myers Shoemaker described the house. He said, "It's a great tower. Its great tower is not habitable, save in its lower story, which is used as a kitchen," which you can still see today. "Ivy peers in the windows and taps on the glass. Today and each day Tintern is going more and more into ruin, and the voracious ivy climbs even higher and higher, pointing like the handwriting on the wall to the ending of it all." Finally, after a night of sickness and fear spent in the abbey, half a century after Shoemaker's visit, it just proved too much, and the last Coakley residents made her decision to leave her home. In 1959, Miss Coakley moved to Tintern House in Salt Mills, which was the village that had been created by her ancestor and part of the estate from monastic times. Ownership of Tintern then passed from private to public, with the abbey and the associated buildings, along with the battlemented bridge and the remains of the old capella, vested in the Commissioner of Public Works in 1963. Most of the land surrounding had been previously sold through the Land Commission, and then the immediate woodlands were bequeathed to the Irish state and are managed by Coillte, the Irish Forestry Board. In total, the Land Commission oversaw the transfer of about just over 14, or just under, I suppose, 14.5 million statute acres of land from estates to tenant purchasers in the period of 1889 to 1999. Today, Tintern, the abbey and the buildings are, as I said at the beginning, managed and maintained by the Office of Public Works on behalf of the Irish people. The visitor reception and the tea room areas are housed in the 19th century stables and in the coach house, respectively. With extensive archaeological works carried out on the site from 1982 until about 2007, so those were carried out under the direction of Dr. Anne Lynch. And these are followed then by conservation works that have been and will be ongoing as required. I suppose just to sum up, in the context of Irish and international studies, Tintern Abbey's main significance lies primarily in the fact that much of the land associated with the foundation formed one cohesive block from medieval to modern times with little interruption. The continuity of ownership of the abbey turned house and the surrounding complex and estate is a situation that is quite unusual in Ireland. And I suppose that, combined with the fact that the core of the original property is now in public ownership, allows the public to enjoy and access the estate in ways that really just wouldn't otherwise be possible. I suppose the ease of the access to the site also allows those who are interested in studying the development of the estate from monastic to landed with really a unique opportunity to be able to explore and to look. I suppose for many people as well, the daily walk around those defined pathways within the woodland is a chance to think and to relax and to escape the everyday life, which really is very little removed from the ideals of the 12th century monks who toiled that same land and escaped the daily routine through prayer and meditation in that same space. So 3 times the abbey and its lands have been completely transformed. First, the development of the holding from barren to productive under the Cistercians meant that the lands in that part of Wexford were utilised in a way that can be contrasted with other patterns within the area. I suppose the unsettled time marking the transformation period of the Reformation left an indelible mark on Tintern because it underwent then its second conversion from former monastic estate to a landed one. And that phase then of the property's evolution stretched from the 1560s to 1959. And then deaths, lawsuit, mismanagement brought financial rule on the owners and the estate. From 1963, the abbey and its lands immediately surrounding it have been in the ownership of the Irish state, marking the third phase of the evolution of the domain from private residence to public amenity. And I suppose then what I've tried to do in this talk is to look at the 3 phases of that transition, and to look at some of the people who have had the greatest impact on the Tintern that we can see today. So with that, I will leave it there. Thank you very much.